Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Tuesday, August 5th, 2025. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. Netanyahu plans full Israeli occupation of Gaza. So Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is set to order the full Israeli military occupation of the Gaza Strip, according to Israeli media reports on Monday. According to Ynet, the Israeli news site, President Trump has given Netanyahu a green light to launch a more aggressive military operation against Hamas in Gaza. So that means Trump has given the blessing for Netanyahu to escalate the genocide that is ongoing in Gaza. A source in Netanyahu's office told the Jerusalem Post that Netanyahu had reached a decision on the full occupation and plans to order military operations in areas where Israel believes its captives are being held by Hamas. An Israeli official told Ynet, quote, "The die is cast. We are going for a full occupation of the Gaza Strip," end quote. The Israeli military has previously pushed back against plans for a full occupation. But Netanyahu's message to the IDF chief of staff, Eyal Zamir, is that if he does not like it, he should quit. The Israeli official said, quote, "There will be operations even in areas where hostages are being held. If the IDF chief of staff doesn't agree, he should resign," end quote. So Netanyahu is set to convene his cabinet on Tuesday, which we covered yesterday. The reports yesterday were that he's planning a big escalation, and now they're saying the full occupation. So what does that mean, the full Israeli military occupation of Gaza? Well, the Israeli military currently controls about 75% of Gaza's territory. And under this new plan, they would work to capture the remaining territory to bring the entire strip under Israeli control. So what does that mean for the millions, 2 million, about, we don't know exactly the number of the population at this point, 1.8, 1.9 million. What does it mean for the Palestinian civilians living in these areas? These reports did not say. We do know that recently top Israeli officials, the defense minister, Israel Katz, announced a plan to build a concentration camp in southern Gaza, what he called a humanitarian city, and the idea would be to push the entire civilian population into this tiny area. We know that that's what they want to do, and there's also reports last week saying that Netanyahu was planning to start annexing territory in Gaza, or at least he was going to propose a plan for that. And we also know, as Netanyahu and other top officials in the Israeli government have been very clear, that they want ethnic cleansing. They want to expel the Palestinian population from Gaza, what they now call the Trump plan. But so far, there's been no indication that any regional countries are willing to take in a sizable amount of Palestinians from Gaza and to facilitate the ethnic cleansing. So we don't know exactly how things are going to go down here. But, you know, if they're talking about escalating things here, I mean, the daily death toll from Gaza has been between about 80 and 110 for weeks now. So if they really escalate things, that means, you know, this could just be an extermination campaign. We could just see them try to kill as many Palestinians as they can and make life as miserable as possible, in hopes that they can drive them out of Gaza. So dark days are ahead for Gaza unless some miracle happens. And there is some push from the U.S. to end this, but we're just not seeing that. We're not seeing that from Trump at all. Just complete, full-throated, 100% support for Israel and Netanyahu. All right, so the next one here, House Speaker Mike Johnson visits a legal settlement in the West Bank. So House Speaker Mike Johnson traveled to the West Bank on Monday to visit a Jewish settlement, which is considered illegal under international law. And this is a very strong show of support for the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territory. According to Ynet, the trip was organized by the Yesha Council Settler Lobby in coordination with the U.S. Israel Education Association, which is a pro-Israeli advocacy group in the U.S. The trip makes Johnson the first sitting House Speaker to visit the West Bank. During his visit to the Ariel settlement in the central West Bank, Johnson declared that the Jewish people have the right to the Palestinian territory, which he referred to as Judea and Samaria, using the biblical name. Johnson said, quote, "Every corner of this land is important to us. It is an integral part of our faith, and therefore the significance for us is great. We stand entirely by your side. Scripture teaches us that the mountains of Judea and Samaria were promised to the Jewish people, and they belong to them by right. But many people around the world do not see it like this. They label it the occupied territories, or the West Bank, or any other name," end quote. So very, amid the starvation campaign, the genocide in Gaza, the Speaker of the House, who's second in line for the presidency after the vice president, if something happens to Donald Trump, goes over to the West Bank and declares that this land belongs to you based on his religious beliefs. And Johnson was joined in his delegation by Representative Michael McCall, Nathaniel Morin, Michael Cloud, and Claudia Tenney, as well as Arkansas Governor Sarah Huckabee Sanders. So the governor of Arkansas, for some reason, is visiting a settlement in the West Bank. Of course, she is the daughter of Mike Huckabee, the U.S. ambassador to Israel. And both Huckabee and Mike Johnson are known for their Christian Zionist views, their belief that God gave historic Palestine to the modern state of Israel. And this is a view that is rejected by the Catholic Church and by most Christian denominations. This is kind of a uniquely American thing. But this is what drives their foreign policy and has a big influence on U.S. foreign policy, and especially this current Trump administration. I mean, what about the Christians in the West Bank? Do they even factor into Mike Johnson's thinking here? So during the visit, Yisrael Gantz, the head of the Yesha Council, asked the U.S. politicians for their support in advancing the goal of the Israeli annexation of the West Bank. He said, quote, "Today we present to you a diplomatic initiative calling to apply the sovereignty of the state of Israel over Judea and Samaria and declare to the whole world that the territories of Judea and Samaria are once again an eternal part of the Jewish state," end quote. So there's no sign that during this visit, Johnson raised the issue of Israeli settler violence, of Israeli settlers murdering 2 American citizens in July, or the attacks on Christians on Taibeh, the Christian village in the West Bank. Again, just does not factor into their thinking on this. And Johnson is expected to also visit Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, GHF, distribution sites in Gaza, which of course are death traps for desperate Palestinians. I'm sure that will be another controlled PR stunt. And what was interesting is, according to an Israeli official speaking to Axios, Mike Johnson is going to spend an unusually long amount of time in Israel. He's going to be in Israel until August 10th, which is, I mean, that's a very long trip. I mean, what other country does the Speaker of the House visit for a week? It's just crazy. And this is something, when he became House Speaker, he said one of his first moves would be to, advance, show support for Israel. And I believe one of the first bills that was brought to the floor was some kind of resolution for Israel. All right, so the next one here, the DHS threatens disaster relief for states that boycott Israel. So this story is really something here. So Reuters reported on Monday that the Trump administration has said that states and cities will not receive funding to prepare for natural disasters if they choose to boycott Israeli companies. And they cited a terms document from the Department of Homeland Security, the DHS, that was published in April. The document says that in order to receive funding from the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, states must certify that they will not engage in a discriminatory prohibited boycott. So how is a discriminatory prohibited boycott defined? The document says that it is defined as refusing to deal, cutting commercial relations, or otherwise limiting commercial relations specifically with Israeli companies or with companies doing business in or with Israel authorized by, licensed by, or organized under the laws of Israel to do business. So it says that this type of boycott that states and cities cannot participate in if they want funding from FEMA is specifically about Israel, about Israeli companies. And the condition on FEMA funding takes aim at boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, the BDS movement, which calls for global boycotts to pressure Israel over its occupation of the Palestinian territories, and now over Israel's ongoing genocide in Gaza. So this news broke, and this is a document, again, dated from April. So I guess Reuters picked up on it, or maybe it was published on the internet recently. But anyway, so there's a huge backlash all over social media, and including from a lot of Trump supporters. And I even saw some, pro-Israel people saying, okay, this is a little too far. Conditioning FEMA funds on how the state or city approaches Israel. I mean, it is really in your face here. So after the backlash, the DHS removed the language about Israel from its terms for the funding, but it released a statement, very like a word salad, basically, that made it clear it was leaving open. I'll just read what DHS said. But again, this is in response to the outrage. The DHS said, quote, "There is no FEMA requirement tied to Israel in any current NOFO. No states have lost funding and no new conditions have been imposed. FEMA grants remain governed by existing law and policy and not political litmus tests. DHS will enforce all anti-discrimination laws and policies, including as it relates to the BDS movement, which is expressly grounded in anti-Semitism. Those who engage in racial discrimination should not receive a single dollar of federal funding," end quote. So if you see what they're saying, they're trying to portray the BDS as some sort of racial thing, racial discrimination, which is just nonsense. So essentially claiming that there's no conditions related to Israel, but we're going to enforce this BDS thing. So, but then they remove the language. Essentially, I think what they're saying, what's happening here is that they realized the language was too explicit, and they did a little damage control, but also leaving open the possibility to take action against states and cities that boycott Israel. And of course, there's no U.S. states that are boycotting Israel. I'm not sure if there's cities. I know there's been cities that have passed resolutions calling for ceasefires in Gaza and things like that. But there's been a push from the Israeli government, from its lobbyists here in the U.S., to target BDS, and this has been ongoing for years. There's more than 30 U.S. states that have anti-BDS legislation on the books. Essentially, if you're a contractor entering a contract with a state, with one of these states, you have to say that you will not boycott Israel, that you're not participating in, or and that you won't take part in a future boycott of Israel, which is just completely outrageous. And we saw these laws come into effect. If you remember, a few years ago, Ben & Jerry's, the ice cream company, announced that it would stop selling ice cream in illegal Israeli settlements in the West Bank. And Ben & Jerry's is now owned by Unilever, which is a British conglomerate. And in response, Israeli government officials called on U.S. states, started contacting governors to start enforcing your anti-BDS laws. And many states did so against Unilever, until Unilever eventually sold its Ben & Jerry's ice cream business in Israel to a local company. So then the action stopped after that. But it's just really, really flagrant violations of the Constitution, of the First Amendment, these anti-BDS laws. And now we're seeing it at the federal level. I mean, FEMA funds, disaster relief funds, based on whether or not an area boycotts Israel. I mean, it's completely outrageous. All right, so the next one here. Former Israeli officials ask Trump to force Netanyahu to end Gaza war. So this article is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. Hundreds of former Israeli officials, including past heads of Mossad and Shin Bet, sent President Donald Trump a letter asking him to force Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to end military operations in Gaza. The letter said that Hamas no longer posed a threat to Israel. So this is a huge group of former IDF generals, Mossad, Shin Bet, police officials, and they're writing President Trump, telling him to force Netanyahu to stop. And why are they doing this? Because President Trump is the only person in the world who could stop this, genocide that is happening. And he could do it in a pretty simple and easy way by cutting the military aid or threatening to cut it. So the letter says, quote, "Stop the Gaza war. Israel's largest group of former IDF generals and Mossad, Shin Bet, and diplomatic corps equivalents. We urge you to end the Gaza war. You did it in Lebanon. Time to do it in Gaza as well. Your credibility with the vast majority of Israelis augments your ability to steer Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his government in the right direction. End the war, return the hostages, stop the suffering, and forge a regional international coalition that helps the Palestinian Authority to offer Gazans and all Palestinians an alternative to Hamas and its vicious ideology," end quote. So they say that he did it in Lebanon. I don't really know what they're referring to. Israel did sign a ceasefire deal related to Lebanon in November 2024, but it has violated it very flagrantly. But it's just interesting. You know, again, we always talk about it as Americans, reason why focus so much on this horrific situation in Gaza is because we're paying for it. You know, this is all funded, supported, enabled, wouldn't be possible without all the U.S. support that Israel gets. And it's interesting to see this big group of former Israeli officials write this letter directly to President Trump. All right, so the next one here, the IDF kills 90 Palestinians in Gaza in 24 hours. So Gaza's health ministry said on Monday that Israeli forces killed 90 Palestinians and wounded 439 over the previous 24-hour period, as U.S.-backed Israeli strikes and the IDF killing of desperate people seeking aid continue. Another 4 bodies were recovered. Among those killed were 29 people gunned down by Israeli forces while seeking food aid. So the aid massacres continue. And it looks like, I mean, we're seeing all these pictures come out because they have allowed slightly more aid trucks to enter northern Gaza, and we've seen the food drops happen. But it's just like, you know, they're getting shot on the way or back from getting the aid. And there's also the massacres still happening near the GHF sites. And it's just, you know, it's just so crazy that this is just going on every single day. People trying to get food just being killed, gunned down and killed. And another thing that happened on Monday, so they've been doing the airdrops of aid. In one case, a pallet hit a tent and killed a Palestinian nurse who was living in the tent. So even the aid being dropped from the sky is killing people. And this has happened before. I remember last year it happened in a few instances. So it's just absolutely horrific. And Israeli airstrikes also continue to pound areas across Gaza. Starvation deaths have continued. The health ministry reported that 5 more adults died of malnutrition over the past 24 hours. The aid is not nearly enough to avert this starvation crisis that is unfolding. They need a full, you know, to lift all restrictions, lift the blockade, and they need a ceasefire for a real humanitarian relief effort. All right, so the next one here, family of Frail boy killed at GHF site still hasn't received his body. This article's from Middle East Eye. So this is that boy, 10-year-old boy named Amir, who was killed by the IDF at a GHF site, who thanked Anthony Aguilar, the retired U.S. Army Green Beret, who's blown the whistle on the GHF operation. He said the boy came up, kissed his hand, and thanked him for the meager few pieces of food, flour that he was able to get. And he walked miles to get to the site with no shoes on. And as he started to leave, he was murdered by the Israeli military. And his family, since Aguilar came out with his story, his family came out. The Middle East Eye found his family, and they said that he disappeared that same day that Aguilar said he was killed. He walked off and followed a crowd to a GHF site. And now this is another story, and they're saying that they have yet to receive his body. They don't know where his body is. And to me, this raises questions about the possibility of the you know, I remember one case, I think this was last year, or maybe it was even 2023. There was a video of two Palestinians walking down the coast on the beach, and they were killed, and then Israeli bulldozers came and just covered their bodies, just buried them right there. And I wonder if they do that with some of the people massacred near the aid sites. There's another story from Al Jazeera in the lower part of the page. of people who say accounts from Palestinians that family members have gone missing. They go to the GHF sites and they don't know what happened. They don't get a body. So this is the case with this little boy, Amir. It's just such a tragic story. I mean, this should be enough to end this story. I mean, Aguilar told this on Tucker Carlson. I mean, how does this not move people within the Trump administration to make a change? All right, so the next one here, the UN says that every child under 5 in Gaza is at risk of malnourishment. So this is from Al Jazeera. The United Nations has warned that all children of Gaza under the age of 5 are at risk of life-threatening malnourishment amid growing reports of starvation-related deaths as Israel continues to block aid from entering the besieged Gaza Strip. The UN's World Food Program said that children in this age bracket, around 320,000 in number, have been affected by the collapse of nutrition services and are lacking access to safe water, breast milk substitutes, and therapeutic feeding. And then again, I mentioned that, did I say, I feel like I might have said 5, but the in the last story, but the actual number, the health ministry said that hospitals in Gaza recorded 6 new deaths from famine and malnutrition, including 1 child. So people are still starving to death every day inside Gaza, being starved to death by Israel. All right, so the next one here, Syrian HTS forces clash with Kurdish SDF. So this article is from Jason Ditz. So despite this so-called integration deal that the SDF, which is the U.S.-backed Kurdish force in northeast Syria, if you see this map here, the orange territory is controlled by them. They signed this integration deal with the HTS al-Qaeda-linked government that took power in Damascus. They've come under attack by this government. There was an attack on SDF positions in the village of Al-Imam on Monday morning, and clashes ranged for about 20 minutes. There had been fights reported over the weekend in and around Manbij, with the government claiming that the Kurds injured 4 soldiers and 3 civilians. So not really clear on the if there's any significant casualties in these clashes. But this is a bad sign because, we saw kind of fighting as the pretext for the massacres of Alawites in western Syria and Druze civilians in southern Syria. When it comes to the Kurds, they're much more well armed. I mean, they have their own military. They're backed by the U.S., so they would be able to put up a fight. I don't think HTS guys would be able to just go in there and start massacring Kurds. But it's just not a good sign for the potential destabilization here. And the U.S. is essentially, backing. You have Tom Barrack. He's been critical. The U.S. envoy to Syria. He's been critical of the SDF. Says, because after they signed the integration deal, they're now saying that they need their own military. They're not going to lay down their arms. And one reason why the Kurds are saying that is because they've seen what's happening to the Alawites, to the Druze. They don't want that to happen to them. And what is Tom Barrack saying? He's saying, no, you got to integrate, lay down your weapons. So it's just really something to see the U.S. essentially backing this new al-Qaeda government against the Kurds, the SDF. All right, so the next one here, 2 wounded as Israel continues to pound southern Lebanon. So this one is another article from Jason Ditz. So Israel continued to carry out attacks across southern Lebanon on Monday with renewed fears of escalation after several deadly strikes late last week. Monday, there multiple towns and villages were targeted. No comments from Israel about what they were targeting. And again, multiple attacks across the south, and at least 2 people were injured. No words on any deaths, but we've just kind of seen an increase in the Israeli strikes on southern Lebanon and signs that they might be preparing for a major escalation here. All right, so the next one here, Russia says that it is no longer bound by the INF moratorium. So the Russian Foreign Ministry said on Monday that Moscow was no longer bound by a self-imposed moratorium on the deployment of missiles that were previously banned by the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, that's the INF treaty, which the U.S. withdrew from in 2019. So the INF prohibited land-based missile systems with a range between 310 and 3,400 miles. And since pulling out of the treaty, the U.S. has developed a missile launcher known as a Typhoon that can fire nuclear-capable Tomahawk missiles, which have a range of over 1,000 miles. So any kind of land-based Tomahawk was banned under the INF. The U.S. has deployed the Typhoon to the Philippines, and China is not happy about that. And they also briefly deployed one to Denmark for drills, and of course that got Russia's attention. And the U.S. has announced plans to deploy missile systems previously banned by the INF to Germany by 2026. And Berlin recently requested to procure its own Typhoon missile system from the U.S. And this is a Typhoon missile system. They're also known as the Mid-Range Capability System, being fired at the White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico. So the Russian Foreign Ministry said in its statement, quote, "With our repeated warnings on that matter having gone ignored and the situation developing towards the de facto deployment of U.S.-made intermediate and shorter-range ground-based missiles in Europe and the Asia-Pacific region, the Russian Foreign Ministry has to declare that any conditions for the preservation of a unilateral moratorium on the deployment of similar arms no longer exist, and it is further authorized to state that the Russian Federation does not consider itself bound by relevant self-restrictions approved earlier," end quote. So essentially saying that they could start deploying similar missile systems. When the U.S. withdrew from the INF treaty in 2019, it was pretty clear that they were withdrawing with China in mind. The U.S. wanted to deploy these medium-range missiles, along the first island chain and aim them at China. So because of that, Russia actually offered a moratorium on the deployment of these weapons in Europe. Say, we won't deploy them in Western Russia. You don't deploy them in Europe. But the U.S. refused, and that was that. And, the U.S. had accused Russia of violating the INF treaty by developing a ground-launched cruise missile. Russia denied the claim, saying that the missile had a maximum range of 298 miles, which is under the INF limits. And Russia also accused the U.S. of potentially violating the treaty by building these Mark 41 missile defense systems in Romania and Poland. Basically, they're based on the Aegis Ashore system on U.S. Navy destroyers. They're a land-based version of that. And because of that, it means the missile launchers can fit Tomahawks. But the U.S. was saying, no, we're not going to put Tomahawks in them. But anyway, so each side had a grievance when it came to the INF treaty, but instead of negotiating or trying to work something out, the U.S. quit in 2019 because it wanted to develop these missile systems. And now tensions are rising. Arms control has completely collapsed between the U.S. and Russia. And they're going to start having more missiles pointed at each other. All right, so the next one here, Russia downplays Trump's comments on nuclear submarines. So the Kremlin on Monday downplayed President Trump's recent announcement that 2 U.S. nuclear submarines were being deployed to appropriate regions in response to comments from former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev. So according to TASS, the Russian news agency, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov noted that U.S. nuclear-armed submarines are always at sea and on patrol, and that is true. So Trump's announcement essentially was just didn't really change anything. He was saying that they were repositioning them so they were in the appropriate areas. I guess if nuclear war broke out with Russia, which is a very provocative thing to do, but Russia's essentially saying, these U.S. submarines are already out there on patrol, and they have very long-range missiles, so it doesn't, it didn't realistically change anything, but Russia's also warning against nuclear rhetoric and saying that everyone should be extremely careful with this type of rhetoric. What's interesting is that Medvedev, who he has not said anything publicly, at least on social media, since Trump made that announcement, so maybe there's a chance the Kremlin told him to take it easy a little bit when it comes to the rhetoric. All right, so the next one here, Senate bill would provide $50 billion to Ukraine. So this one's from Kyle, again, at the Libertarian Institute. So Senators Jeanne Shaheen, a Democrat from New Hampshire, and Lisa Murkowski, a Republican from Alaska, introduced a bill that will provide $50 billion in military aid for Ukraine. The assistance is intended to fund the proxy war for another 2 years. This is the legislation would also prevent the president from halting aid shipments, trying to tie the president's hand to ensure that the military aid continues to flow. And the legislation would provide $30 billion in direct military assistance, $12 billion in presidential drawdown authority, and $3 billion in foreign military financing. So we'll see if this gets any momentum in the Senate, if they get a lot of co-sponsors. But the reality is that if the U.S. wants this war to go on for years, for the next several years, Trump is going to have to get authorization from Congress for more funding, and that would be a huge betrayal of his base and what he ran on. But if this is something that the goes through Congress, I wouldn't be surprised if we see him signing a bill like this into law if he really wants to keep funding the war. This is what is going to have to happen. All right, so the last one here: people in Sudan's El-Fasher eat animal fodder to survive. So this is another article from Al Jazeera. I just wanted to put some attention on the situation in El-Fasher in Sudan, which has been under siege by the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, and the situation there is very dire. Similar stories we've seen come out of Gaza. So people in Sudan's North Darfur region, so this is in Sudan in the North Darfur region, they are forced to eat animal fodder to survive as the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces continues to lay siege to El-Fasher, the last urban center in the region under army control. So Othman Angaro from a displacement camp in El-Fasher told Al Jazeera, quote, "We are suffering world. We need humanitarian aid, food, and medicine, whether by airdrop or by opening ground routes. We cannot survive in this condition," end quote. Angaro described how he and his family rely on livestock fodder known as ambas, a type of animal feed made out of peanut shells. Another woman, veterinarian Solfa Al-Noor, told Al Jazeera that her family relies daily on a charity kitchen for a single meal amid a total lack of external aid. She called for urgent international intervention, including airdrops of humanitarian supplies, warning that even the ambas fodder is nearly depleted. So the animal food, they're almost out of as well. The Integrated Food Security Phase classification last week warned about starvation in the El-Fasher region. Starvation has reached the most severe level on the UN-backed food security scale, the IPC Phase 5, indicating full-blown famine, it said on Friday. The 2-month siege of El-Fasher has complicated aid efforts. So, maybe and there's also a cholera outbreak in the North Darfur state, so it's just adding to the misery. Maybe I've missed it, but, the Trump administration has worked to end other conflicts, mediating and brokering talks. And again, maybe I've missed it because I haven't been following Sudan too closely, but I haven't seen any effort from the Trump administration to broker anything between the RSF and the Sudanese army. And I know previous efforts really didn't get anywhere. So this war just kind of grinds on with no end in sight, really, unfortunately. So that is it for the news for today. Please go check out our Viewpoints, one from Aviva Chomsky, Creating a Cover for Genocide. One from Ron Paul, Cold War 2.0 Heats Up. One from Caitlin Johnstone, Israel's genocidal intentions have been obvious this whole time. One from William Dunkerley, Here's What Gabbard's Russiagate Report Missed. And our spotlight from Jack Hunter, How MTG Became MAGA's Moral Compass on Gaza. So please go check all of that out. You could always support this show by liking, subscribing, commenting, all that stuff I always tell you to do. Tell your friends about antiwar.com. I've been starting to post the show on Substack. I don't know if people really watch videos over there. But that's another place you could follow me, is my Substack page that I just kind of started up. But anyway, that is it for me for today. I will be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.